And nothing regarding this is a surprise. It is the system working as designed. It is a test flight, and every type of aviation plane that goes up, whether it's a rocket, whether it's a new airliner, whether it's a new general aviation aircraft, whether it's a military aircraft, they all go through test flights. They all push the edges of what the aircraft or the rocket is capable of, trying to make it fail in the interest of safety. And so it would not be good for aviation. It would not be good for the space program. It would not be good for the passengers in any of these programs if we restrict test pilots and test flights from doing what they're designed to do. And that is to push the vehicle past its limits, find out where the points of failure are, and then make plans about it. And the first thing that they do is they make sure that when they do that, it's safe below.
There's a lot of videos circulating X right now of the breakup of Ship 33 over the Turks and Caicos area. And while Flight 7 was a massive success in terms of the booster catch, the second ever catch of a booster by the chopsticks in Mechazilla Tower, SpaceX, of course, didn't want to lose Ship 33, but don't be fooled, there was a plan for this in place, and everyone flying around that area already knew about it. I wanted to talk to a pilot to get to the bottom of this. Was this really dangerous for people flying in the area, and what happens with this sort of event? I really wanted to dive into more of the spectacular show that some people got over Turks and Caicos area. There's a lot of videos surfacing right now, and I feel like we don't have a lot of information on how dangerous this really was, how big of a deal it was. So can we get some insight?
Yeah, I am super envious of the video that I see that was the pilots from the flight deck. I wish that I had been flying today and close enough to be able to see it myself. It looked absolutely spectacular. And I've seen the same comments that you have online. And it's simply a subject of people just don't understand what flight planning is, what contingency planning is, what the FAA process is to protect the launch corridor. And I thought I could provide at least a little bit of context around that, because my job is I'm an airline pilot. I'm a co-pilot or first officer on a 787. I normally fly international routes. I've flown many other types of aircraft before that. I've flown through that very same airspace in the Caribbean, and I'm familiar with the NOTAM process. So I can at least say it from a pilot's perspective. It was not dangerous at all. It was quite a show. It was spectacular, and the FAA's plans worked out exactly as they were supposed to.
Yeah, so I was seeing, Scott Manley in particular, who's also learned to fly and is a pilot as well now, had been posting about some of the planes had to divert or, change their route. Is that true? And is that a big issue?
Let's start from the beginning of what the actual plan is that the FAA has in place. So what SpaceX will send the plan of their desired launch corridor to the FAA and exactly when they think they're going to be in which location and at which altitude. And then the FAA disseminates that out to all the pilots that could potentially be in the vicinity via a process called a NOTAM. These NOTAMs are not unusual for pilots. We're required to look at them before every single flight. So if a pilot did not check out the NOTAMs before the flight, they were in violation of the federal rules. But even if they hadn't, then there will be a backup that when the rocket's in the vicinity, the FAA or ATC will typically send a notice out to every airplane in the area saying, oh, by the way, there's a SpaceX launch that will be going out overhead. Now, that's controller discretion, but in my experience, that normally happens. We have continuous communication with ATC. We also have continuous communication with our company and our dispatchers. So that's just the first element of safety that's layered in there. And then that airspace that could be the potential flight path, once you're up past the initial launch area, it starts to become a discretion of where do you cut off the actual airspace closure and move into a warning area. Because once the rocket is actually in space, as it was in this instance, it's miles and miles above the Earth. So you have time to move aircraft if you need to. They don't have to not be there in the first place. So I'm not quite sure exactly where this was versus the closed airspace or the warning airspace, but to my mind, functionally, it makes no difference because of the altitude that Starship 7 was when it had its rapid unscheduled disassembly. And that was 90 miles above the Earth.
Right.
And that is well into space. It's above the tropopause. The tropopause around that latitude would be 60,000 feet. The airliners fly at a max of 42,000 feet is usually the service ceiling of the airplane. Biz jets can fly a little bit above that. It's still 50,000 feet. So you're talking about 7 miles above the Earth is where the airliners were.
Wow.
Starship was 90 miles above the Earth. Now, all of a sudden, those videos you saw, when you know there's an 83-mile buffer zone in between them, it doesn't seem at all close. And it wasn't at all close. It was just a spectacular show.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the new year. 2025 is going to be a huge year for space news, and I'm so excited that my channel is growing with almost 200,000 subscribers now. It's truly mind-blowing, and the more people that are getting to know me on the internet means that more people are searching information about me, and some of that information, of course, I want to keep private. That's why for almost an entire year now, I've been trusting Delete Me to help keep my information private, and they've been doing a great job. Delete Me is the sponsor of today's video, and since February 16th of last year, they've reviewed almost 30,000 listings, found 85 data brokers with my info, and they've been keeping on top of things to remove hundreds of listings so that my information stays private. And this will work for you too. This is how it works. Delete Me submits removal requests from data brokers where they find your information. For example, you can see in this chart that my exposed data included address, family members, name, spouse, which I actually have never been married, and my relationship status. So Delete Me sends you a privacy report showing each of the data brokers they've scanned, what they found, and what they're doing to remove your data. After they submit each opt-out, their privacy advisors go back and check each source again to make sure your information has actually been removed, saving you a lot of time, and this is why they make multiple reports a year. And this is, for example, why a membership is so beneficial, so that they can continue to go back and make sure that your information hasn't been reposted, because yeah, that's a thing. I personally trust Delete Me and feel more secure knowing that my information won't be subject to threats of harassment, identity theft, even stalking. And you can get 20% off Delete Me US consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/Ellie20 and use promo code Ellie20 at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/Ellie20, code Ellie20.
With those videos, especially the one from the cockpit, I mean, was anyone in danger of going through that? And what would have happened, say, even though there was that buffer, say for some reason a plane happened to go through that?
Well, the only airplane that would have been going through that would have been maybe like a drug dealer that was not on an FAA flight plan. That's the airspace in that area is, it's international waters. It's there. You need flight plans to be flying over it. This isn't just simply like people going so far out into what if into the realm of complete improbability to say something like that. And it just like kind of bends the rules of space-time to think that an object can go from 90 miles above the Earth to 7 miles above the Earth instantaneously. It's simply not going to happen. So I can tell you what the process would be once SpaceX knew that things hadn't gone as planned. Then SpaceX has a line to the FAA. They let the FAA know. Then the FAA just puts in place their pre-scheduled plan. They notify ATC. They notify also usually the airline dispatch offices of every single airline that's operating in the area. And the pilots are then receiving 2 sets of notifications in the flight deck, one from ATC and then one from their airline. And this is something that we would usually have talked about on the ground before we ever got in there. Oh, by the way, there's a SpaceX launch that's going over, and our flight plan it's maybe 20, 40 miles off of this warning area. If we were going through the warning area, I typically would have just routed myself around it. I wouldn't have even flown through it unless like my destination was on the other side. And even then I wouldn't be worried because as you saw, all the airliners were nowhere close at any point when the debris came down. We only have one video and it was very far away in that video, as spectacular as the show was. So it just was not close. The delays is simply something that needs to be put into context. If you look at when Kamala Harris came to San Francisco to do a presidential fundraiser, San Francisco is not very far from the airport that she flew into. When she moves as a presidential vice president, a flight restriction zone is put around her as she moves. And airliners, we have to plan around that. And sometimes we're held on the ground. We're not even allowed to take off because that flight restriction zone will cover San Francisco International Airport. So and that's hundreds of flights that are affected. We saw a max of 20 flights. It looks like that might have done some holding, some rerouting around it. That's less than will go around the average thunderstorm that we fly through. It's just, it's a very small number. It was just getting a lot of people looking at it.
Oh, wow. Because it was almost making it sound more dramatic, like, oh, all of these planes have to shift their flight path and this is so dangerous. And, you know, I think that we're going to see more of those comments. And so that's why I wanted to get the video out tomorrow, because that's kind of the other half of this. I was on the ground. I saw the booster catch, which was phenomenal. But, you know, it seems like even coming from Scott Manley, for example, the tone seemed more negative. And you're saying, no, SpaceX did what they were supposed to do. There were really no surprises other than the ship rutting, but nothing was unsafe. Even the debris falling was still in that area that they had planned for.
It was all pre-planned. It was all pre-planned. We know this because we do have a post from Elon Musk that says all the debris fell within the scheduled hazard area. So nothing was a surprise. Nothing was unplanned. Why any airplanes moved around at all is because Cuba's right there. And Cuba has overflight permits that are required for airliners to fly above it, and they're expensive. So in many circumstances, airlines do not choose to buy the overflight Cuba permit for over Cuba. So then that limits where airliners can be to begin with. And then typically, as airplanes are making approaches, say into San Juan in Puerto Rico or into Punta Cana, which I've flown into both of those places many, many times. I was actually based in San Juan, Puerto Rico, myself for a while. And they have to come in through these corridors because you're entering other countries' airspace. So they have designated entry points where you can exit their airspace. You can't just fly in any place you want to. So that's creating restrictions on where the airplanes can fly. And then if you add in another restriction of the hazard area, then air traffic controllers just have to come up with a different solution of how they're going to sequence the airplanes through than the one they were originally thinking of. And I can guarantee you that ATC was giving it a much broader swath than the actual hazard area was, just in an abundance of caution once that they knew there was an issue. So they were just sequencing aircraft into a normal arrival pattern, and they probably had one or two departure or arrival corridors that they would normally use that they would prefer not to use in this scenario. That is no different than when I'm flying into Houston and there's a thunderstorm on the departure end. And then we all get calls from ATC. We all get, you're now flying this departure, you're not flying that departure, you're rerouting around the thunderstorm. We do this so many times a year, I can't even probably calculate it. So it's such a non-event to an airline pilot, but to someone like Scott Manley, he flies airplanes and he avoids all the weather because he's smart and he has a choice, and he's not doing this as a career. And so for him, he doesn't deal with NOTAMs the same way except as a no-go decision. He doesn't deal with temporary flight restrictions because the president's moving around, or because there's a Super Bowl and you're still flying the passengers in there, or because military airspace went hot. All of which an airline pilot does so many times. It's just a routine part of our job. So there was nothing at all out of the abnormal here, except some airline pilots got a beautiful, spectacular show from the flight deck.
So you can say pretty confidently that the pilot who was viewing this was probably really enjoying it.
Yes, 100%. And then all of his buddies he told about were like, darn, why do you have all the luck? Why did I not get to see that myself? Because that was my reaction.
Well, and there's videos popping up. I've seen a few. There's one on a cruise. There's one, some people are seemingly partying. And there's a little girl's voice in the background of one of them saying, oh, is this going to fall on the people? And so I think we want to make clear, because some people might say, oh, this is another, thing falling out of the sky. We see some of this with Chinese space where it's actually super uncontrolled and very dangerous. So was this at any risk of hurting someone on land?
No, that's why they have the designated launch corridor. I mean, this is all pre-planned. It's all calculated, and I find it a little really laughable that people understand that SpaceX can do the calculations to land super heavy booster on chopsticks, but then somehow think that these same actual rocket scientists can't do the calculations to know what the path is going to be of the rocket that they're sending up and where underneath it that they want to have a clear zone. It's the simplest thing that they're asked to do in relation to the entire launch.
Yeah.
The fact that these things are in space and we're not, it means that we have plenty of time to deal with any issues that come up, and we have the means and the notification. And just, even though this would be a different reason to divert, I divert for someone having a heart attack on board. I divert around a typhoon. I divert because military airspace went hot. It's simply not a new procedure for an airline pilot to change our routing to something that we view as safer in the abundance of caution, or even though the threat is very minimal, if non-existent, if we're talking about a SpaceX launch.
Do you think that this is going to really concern the FAA or cause a massive delay for Starship and their ambitious plans?
I would be very surprised if the FAA has any issue with the plan and procedures they put in place working exactly as they intended and being followed to the exact way that they wanted them to be followed. It would be a questionable decision to me if that was the case, because this was what was supposed to happen if the Starship 7 didn't make it into orbit, and everything played out is exactly as expected. The thing that could have interrupted the launch cadence was if they could not identify why it exploded. And
Right.
we already have had a post from Elon Musk saying what the mechanical issue likely was, what their planned fix would be, and that would be the information that the FAA is going to look at. But they have already indicated that they understand that these are test flights. And, a test flight is not a new concept. That we've been having space test flights since Apollo. I mean, that's the 1960s. It is not new at all. We've had new aircraft test flights that have been going on. The FAA has a very defined protocol for following this. If I just don't see how that could happen, that the FAA would have an issue with this working just because a few people misunderstood what they were seeing, no matter how many posts they make on X or no matter how many times they say something that's just simply played out differently than they thought. That's just the way that it is. As far as is this never a concern? North Korea will send out test rockets. We don't have a lot of warning. My brother-in-law is also a pilot. He's had to divert his flight path around that. I've had to divert my flight path when the Chinese government surrounds the island of Taiwan in military exercises. So we do this as well. Like, this is all part of the normal parts of operating a safe airline flight, and we have a lot of resources to be able to do that. The FAA is constantly in contact with the airline management. The airline management and dispatchers are constantly getting briefings from experts in each of these areas, and then we're getting briefings from them. We get an extensive briefing before we start each flight. It would not have been a surprise to the pilots flying that day on that route that the Starship launch was happening. That's just a known contingency that they're looking at, and they already have the plan in place. Now, what can the airlines do about it? They can reroute way around it. They can add extra fuel on board. They can say that we don't think it's going to be very likely that the Starship is going to break up anywhere in the vicinity where we are. So we plan to just enter a hold well outside of the area, let the airplane hold until that window of the debris falling, which is a limited time period, is done.
Right.
And then go ahead onto our destination and land. The only reason why any airplanes would divert is if they were fuel limited. They had so many passengers and so much cargo on board, they couldn't add that extra fuel on board. And they just made that decision because you can take off some cargo. You don't have to carry it all. That if this happens, we're just going to divert back because that's the way that we choose to operate this flight. Or if they decided, say in the Turks and Caicos, what if some debris fell on the airport surface? Now we might want to do a runway inspection, and then they might not have a procedure in place in the Turks and Caicos airport for how they would do this runway inspection. So now they have to get someone to sign off on it on their version of the FAA called the CAA. So like there's reasons why something that was planned could create a few extra delays. One of them being that Cuba was, like I said, in the vicinity, and we have restricted flights over Cuba. Even in San Juan, Puerto Rico, there's specific entry points around San Juan that you can enter that airspace. So it was because there's so many countries within the area that it limits the paths where the airplanes can easily fly without having ATC having to do some vectors for sequencing, which is just not a big issue. It's what controllers are very, very good at. And they do it every time an airplane comes in or departs a major airport.
And one last question. It is SpaceX that is conducting the investigation for the FAA. It's not the FAA that comes out with a checkboard and says, or a clipboard and says, hey, that's not how it goes.
It's completely up to the government agency how they want to handle an investigation. So I saw a notice, I'm not sure if it's true, I didn't get to verify it, that they were looking at Blue Origin's successful orbit because it didn't come back. So it's just, they can open an investigation for anything. That doesn't mean it's not anything more than filling out a report and putting it in the file. It doesn't mean that it's going to prevent any type of, prevent the next launch. And I would just look to the guidance of Elon Musk, who has been exceptionally transparent at every single stage of SpaceX development of the Starship program. And he said that they don't see any reason why this would delay the next launch. So I think that's a pretty good indication of what's going to happen. And I would just be very surprised because everything worked according to plan. So usually if you delay a launch when everything worked according to plan, at least from the FAA and the launch corridor, then that's not motivated because of the events that happened that day. That's motivated by something else that's going on, but not by those events. SpaceX will have people that sole job is to determine these launch corridors. That's what they do. They do it from the moment that the rocket would leave the pad all the way up to a stable orbit, and they determine if it failed at any point of that, where is it coming down? Where are the debris coming down? And they have the plan in place, and then they submit that to the FAA, and the FAA says, this is good, this is acceptable, there's nothing here that can be harmed, and they sign off on it. They were in that corridor. And then coming back, the same thing happens. From the moment they start the reentry and leave the stable orbit, they're also doing those same calculations of if we exploded ourselves because we see something we don't like, if we have the type of scenario where we had today, if that happens, where are the debris going to fall? Is that safe? The FAA looks at, they say that's safe. Any other countries is flying over are probably doing the same thing. And it's all going to plan. It's all very, There's layers and layers of safety. There's layers and layers of contingency planning, and nothing regarding this is a surprise. It is the system working as designed. It is a test flight, and every type of aviation plane that goes up, whether it's a rocket, whether it's a new airliner, whether it's a new general aviation aircraft, whether it's a military aircraft, they all go through test flights. They all push the edges of what the aircraft or the rocket is capable of, trying to make it fail in the interest of safety. And so it would not be good for aviation. It would not be good for the space program. It would not be good for the passengers in any of these programs if we restrict test pilots and test flights from doing what they're designed to do. And that is to push the vehicle past its limits, find out where the points of failure are, and then make plans about it. And the first thing that they do is they make sure that when they do that, it's safe below.
And here's the latest statement from the FAA. Quote, the FAA is requiring SpaceX to perform a mishap investigation into the loss of the Starship vehicle during launch operations on January 16th. There are no reports of public injury, and the FAA is working with SpaceX and appropriate authorities to confirm reports of public property damage on Turks and Caicos. During the event, the FAA activated a debris response area and briefly slowed aircraft outside the area where space vehicle debris was falling, or stopped aircraft at their departure location. Several aircraft requested to divert due to low fuel levels while holding outside impacted areas. So I wanted to give a big thank you to Amy for this wonderful interview. I had so many questions and she gave such thorough answers. If you want to follow her on X, she's @_SF Tahoe, and I really appreciate her knowledge as a Boeing 787 airline pilot. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you like Starship related news, please make sure to subscribe to my channel, Ellie in Space, and I'll see you in the next one.